College football nerds here to talk Ohio State, Penn State. It's been a great game for us in the past. It was kind of our doorway into the Big Ten a few years ago, talking with you knuckleheads, and it's been great ever since. I want to remind everybody, please like and subscribe. If you haven't subscribed already, shame on you. I know you like what we're talking about. Even you PSU fans, Penn State fans, y'all like it too. I want to remind you also, we have a website, collegefootballnerds.com. If you like following your favorite college team statistically in the NFL, we condense all that for you. We scrape the NFL stats database. So if you want to see how all the Penn State players are doing this Sunday, last Sunday, for the year, all the Ohio State players, we've got it right there. It's broken down by player. It's broken down by position. We even calculate DBU, wide receiver U, NFLU, things like that. So it's a great place to keep you from having to search a bunch of box scores. It's right there at your fingertips. Want to also remind y'all, before we get into this discussion, we got a top 10 video that we're doing every week. Ohio State is number one, but we talk about a whole lot of other stuff in that. And we are doing an LSU Ohio State hypothetical with the computer model and a discussion, so you can hear a couple of former SEC guys talk about why we think Ohio State would probably beat LSU right now. So y'all probably like that too. All right. That's enough for the super long, super verbose intro. Josh, let's talk about this game. The thing that we were talking about before we started recording was what are some angles that Penn State might have in this game that people aren't thinking about, and where Penn State might have an advantage. And what I would like to point out is everybody's going to point to Wisconsin and say Ohio State blew out Wisconsin. Wisconsin's got a better defense than Penn State, and therefore Ohio State's going to put up 40, 50 points on Penn State or whatever. They're not going to say 50, but anyway. I would argue that because of Penn State's overall athletic, advantage that they would have over Wisconsin, that could potentially drastically change the calculus, even if collectively Wisconsin has a better overall defense, which I'm not sure they do. Penn State's more athletic than them. And based on what we saw in that Ohio State-Wisconsin game, that might be an advantage or a big difference maker in this game in terms of how Ohio State's going to approach it or how much success they can have. Maybe unpack that for us a little bit.
So something I've talked about for a while is Ohio State is really leveraging the freak athletes they have on the offensive side of the ball to give people issues. They're taking guys and splitting them out really wide a lot. The receivers are fast, really explosive players that have to be played fairly tight in the screen game, and they've got to have safety help on the outside. And Fields has the rocket arm where he can get the ball to the outside on simple throws. I say simple throws not as a mean thing, but just the point being he can get the ball out there quick, 5-10 yards downfield. A lot of quarterbacks can't get the ball to the boundary that quick, and so those throws don't kind of exist for them. When you can do that, they can go 3 or 4 wide, and they'll get the corners way out on the edges, kind of near the sideline, both sides of the field. The safeties have to sort of split out, and then they isolate you in the middle. And what they did against Wisconsin is they ran a lot of zone read concepts where they've got their linemen. Wisconsin's basically got their linemen and their linebackers in Ohio State saying, hey, I think I can do the zone read here with Fields and Dobbins, and I'm going to take away by reading one of your guys. And then I think your linebacker is going to fail to get out in front of whoever keeps the ball. And several times that's exactly what happened. And Wisconsin really had no counter to it. So the problem that they had was really a lack of athleticism, I think, in their front seven. And Wisconsin is a hard-nosed, well-coached team. They play good football. They play sound football. They do not recruit at an elite level. Penn State has recruited better athletes than Wisconsin. And even if they're not as physical in some ways, and I think Penn State is a very good physical football team, but I think Wisconsin maybe, it's always been their trademark, and I think that maybe was their strength. It was their weakness against Ohio State. I don't think Ohio State's going to have as much success with that concept because I think Penn State can actually get out in front and just be able to get a hat on a hat and not get out leveraged the way that Wisconsin did. And look, you can miss tackles just as long as you're in the way and you're making contact and you don't let the guy get clean through a lane. And that was Wisconsin's problem. So I do think Penn State has more of an advantage in that regard. It was a matchup issue, not even really a quality issue. The athleticism that Penn State has is probably going to force Ohio State to play them more straight up. That's not to say that Ohio State's going to find it easy, but they had something they could sort of exploit that broke that Wisconsin game open from how it should have gone. I'm not sure that Penn State has that singular weakness, even though there have been some questions with the pass defense. I just don't think there's a singular weakness there was with the Wisconsin game.
Yeah, and quick follow-up on that, because I tweeted during the Minnesota game that athlete to athlete, Penn State had a decided advantage defensively versus Minnesota's offense. And anytime that Minnesota ran something more straight up, more traditional, Penn State ate them alive. What they were struggling with was scheme, specifically RPO scheme. And even though Penn State runs a lot of RPO schemes as well, and not that great, they were struggling with it defensively. And it was one of the first teams they faced that could do that well. This is another place that I think Penn State might have. It's not necessarily an advantage because it's different, but might have an area where Ohio State's bread and butter isn't going to exploit these deficiencies on Penn State's defense like Minnesota's bread and butter did. Don't get me wrong, Ohio State's still going to run some RPO, but maybe discuss the nuances of what they faced in a very RPO-heavy offense with Minnesota versus a more zone read spread concept with Ryan Day with a little RPO sprinkled in.
The problem for the RPO for a lot of people is the RPO requires you to sort of play on your heels. You're constantly backing up into lanes as a linebacker, and that's tough, and it's sort of contrary to what a lot of linebackers want to do. I think Penn State's at their best when they're attacking. They want to be aggressive. The linebackers want to get in the lane. They do a very good job of that against traditional offenses. They were a little off kilter, really, Minnesota, and a little bit too with Indiana, where they were having to drop into coverage and they weren't able to be aggressive, and they seemed like they were kind of awkward with it. I think to a certain extent it's probably because of who they played early in the season. They didn't play many teams that operated these concepts at a high level. Michigan's tried to. They weren't there yet, though I will say they had success late with some RPO concepts. Maryland is an RPO-heavy team, but Maryland is also incompetent. Outside that, nobody else has really got that kind of offensive style. And we've seen this from good defenses. It's the reason that Alabama, Nick Saban, runs the RPO scheme is that Nick Saban, I think, got so fed up because his hard-nosed attacking defense with all these really aggressive linebackers were suddenly being asked to drop back into coverage and to help out. And they couldn't really operate effectively, and it took away a lot of their blitzing ability, and all of a sudden man coverage gets exposed. Penn State has the same problems. And you say, okay, well, that's just the linebackers, but it's the corners that are getting beat or the safeties. The problem is the linebackers, one, they're supposed to be taking the lanes away on those inside throws so that they don't get to the safeties and the corners. Because in man coverage, you can't cover those concepts unless the linebacker's in the lane to prevent the throw. Or you've got to get pressure, but you usually can't get pressure that fast. And then if you're having that much success, you can't get pressure. So the corners, they get stuck on an island because you start dropping more guys into coverage because when you bring a blitz, you get burned. And now the corners are, downfield one-on-one, even though there's no pass rush because you're floating all these guys in the middle of the field. It's just kind of a nightmare for some defenses. I think Penn State got caught a little flat-footed with that. Conversely, while Ohio State does run RPO concepts, I'm going to make that very clear with Fields, they are not reliant on RPO concepts. They are not an RPO first team. They are more a traditional zone read team. And there's a differentiator, and I think somebody tweeted this at us a while back and said, here, see, they do run RPO. And what they actually sent us was a zone read with a play fake. There's a difference. The RPO versus the zone read is who you're reading. Are you reading the linebacker and whether he drops or sinks? Or are you reading a defensive end and how he crashes? You can do some kind of quasi-RPO stuff. Some people do some checks to where they'll throw to the receivers and they'll call that an RPO. The true RPO is actually reading a second-level defender on the defense. Ohio State generally reads a first-level defender. They're going to read one of the defensive linemen most of the time, and then that's going to choose how they do the run plays. And sometimes they do a play-action concept off it where they'll fake it and then throw over the top. And occasionally they do actually transition to full RPO when they start reading a second-level defender. But most of the time, from what I've seen, Ryan Day's offense does tend to read the DN. That's a little easier for the linebackers, though, because you're now taught to attack the mesh, which means you get to go downhill. They're more comfortable with that in a more aggressive mindset. They kind of know where their role is, and they're paying attention to the quarterback and their gaps rather than thinking, if you want, behind them about the coverage responsibilities they have. I'll be curious if Ohio State goes more RPO heavy, given how Penn State struggled against RPO concepts. But it's always a good thing when Ohio State wants to do zone read because they want to use Fields' legs and they want to use Dobbins' legs. Penn State is better against that aspect of it. And if Ohio State has to do the RPO stuff and rely on that as a first option, that's not something they've really had to do or tried to do. I'm not sure how comfortable or consistent Fields would be with that. And you'd much rather him take that route than try to do the zone read stuff, because if they can zone read you all day, which is what they did at Wisconsin, the earlier discussion, I think Ohio State can murder you.
It's really weird that we've got two teams in the same division making it this far into the season without a lot of common opponents, a lot of transitive data points to look at. So I don't think that there's much we can get out of that. But I do wonder, taking the common opponents off the table and just looking at, so we've got Ohio State number one because they've consistently been the most complete team. And we don't necessarily care how many ranked teams you've beaten or how many, the worst and my favorite, because I laugh at it, is so-and-so is number one or should be number one because they've beaten so-and-so number of teams with a winning record. I don't care if in November you've beaten 5 teams that are 6-5. I just don't care. It doesn't matter if you're a number one team in the country, if they're 6-5 or 2-10. Like, it doesn't matter. You're going to kill them. But if we're just kind of distilling this whole game down to one thing, is it that Penn State has either lost to a team like Minnesota or struggled with a team like Iowa, and Ohio State is complete enough that they've just dominated absolutely everyone they played? Admittedly, not that many top-level teams, but the fact that they've consistently dominated while Penn State has not consistently dominated Pitt and Michigan, who's a better team, but Iowa, Minnesota, does it really boil down to that and nothing else?
I think it may. So there's two sides to that coin. The first is a question of dominance, and second is the question of scheduling. Scheduling does not make you good or bad. Scheduling is the lens through which your team has to be evaluated. And we said early on we weren't necessarily as high as some people were with some of the opponents that Ohio State had. I still stick by that to a certain extent. I don't know that their schedule is necessarily a murderer's row. I think they're good teams. And I think they're quite good teams. And I think dominating those teams is very telling. But Cincinnati, for example, wins 20-17 last week against South Florida. Their schedule, and you called this out, I'll give you credit for it. You made the point real early in the season, like, yeah, they're probably going to be something like a 10-win team, and they may not be top 25 quality because their schedule is exceptionally weak. And they have struggled against some teams that have proven not to be particularly good. That doesn't make Ohio State bad. It just means that it's hard to take too much from the Cincinnati game. It's hard for us to take too much from Ohio State against Wisconsin because I don't know how high Wisconsin is. Michigan State is not a good team, and their defense is not an elite defense. In fact, I'm not even sure it's a good defense this year. But Ohio State has still dominated. The question is, then, to the second point, is Penn State's schedule that much tougher that the close games close the gap? I don't know. And we talked about this in the top 10 preview thing, but I'm going to repeat it here. Sorry if you've listened to both. I'll try to take a different angle. Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, those teams.
Wisconsin.
Yeah, Wisconsin's really in that same group. Those teams have all been clumped. Penn State's been clumped too. They're all playing one-score games against each other. And when you look at the out-of-conference stuff, they've been generally only a couple of good out-of-conference data points. Iowa winning close over Iowa State, and then obviously Penn State Pitt. That's about it. And how much credit do you give for those? Right now, Penn State has a lot of really highly ranked teams. And if they were really highly ranked and I had that much confidence in their quality, then I'd probably back off this point a lot. I don't have as much confidence, frankly, in Iowa's ranking right now. Michigan's looked really good. They kind of came on the past few weeks and genuinely did. I do kind of wonder if there were some changes behind the curtain. That's a different discussion for a different day. Minnesota is, I think, a good team. I think it's telling that Penn State looked better athletically than Minnesota, but we don't know. And it's going to be at a bit of a show-me game for that reason. And look, we have to discuss what's in front of us. And we can be completely wrong. It's really weird to have two teams in the same conference where we have this little overlap. It's a problem that exists in conference expansion. 9-game conference schedules help, but 9-game conference schedules can only do so much. And again, cough, cough. And no, you're not allowed to go on a rant on this, Daniel. But when you schedule a Rutgers, Ohio State, your 9th game is effectively an FCS team. And no, Rutgers has not been good at any point other than 2 years in the late 2000s. So that doesn't really help us either, because you're both beating up on a team that everybody's going to beat.
I will say it would help us if somebody struggled with Rutgers. Like, that's a data point too. But they're right now against the top, I think since they've joined, against the top 4 finishers in the Big Ten that year, there's something like 2-50. So it's really hard to know anything from that game. To your point, and I think your point is super fair, and we need to reiterate this because it's the same thing with Clemson. You can't help who's on your schedule. 9 games, 8 games, whatever. Ohio State can't help that TCU dropped out and they had to get Cincinnati on their schedule to fill that game. They can't help that. What they can help is how they play against that schedule, and they've absolutely murdered people. And we're consistent in that we have always appreciated that consistency, and it's actually been missing from Ohio State in the past. And that's what the Alabamas of the world have done. There's only one Alabama of the world, has done. And now Ohio State's doing it, and that's why we have number 1, because they can't help who they play, but they've killed them all.
Right, and it's kind of funny because we're making the same argument that we've made in the past for Alabama, and I hope people appreciate the fact that we're being consistent with it. That Alabama has, what are they, like 80, 81 unranked opponents in a row? It's 90?
90 unranked. It's a record. 90 unranked.
Yeah, it's the continuing record, and Ohio State should have been this team. And that's what Ryan Day's made them. This is why we were critical of Ohio State, because this is what they should have been if you wanted to consider them the number 1 team and you wanted to view them the way we view them right now. And everybody said, why don't you view them this way? This is why. This is what the season should have looked like if you're the kind of team that you think you ought to be. It's why they haven't had a repeat of the 2014 season. That's what I see from Ohio State. And that kind of punctuates the whole discussion here. Ohio State is the team that we've been waiting for them to look like since 2014 for us to re-anoint them. We haven't been wrong, or at least proven wrong, to not re-anoint them. Right now, I feel like they're back at that level. The shame of it is it just hasn't been proven, and this is going to be kind of the show me game to have a better grasp of where that is.
All right, so we do have a computer model, so why don't I'm going to challenge you to get into the data, get into the model without explaining the model, because everybody's heard
it. Fair point. So we have a model that is a comparative model that's based entirely on the strength of your opponents, your performance in past games, that builds a unique scoring model for your team. It's not a linear model. It's a regressive, curve-based model, if you will. And it's based sort of on determining where the outliers are for your teams, where things shut down, where things work better, where are points where your team is either going to explode offensively or break down, and how do you get points from unusual ways? And it's comparative against your opponent. People have asked us to do top 10s, and this is an aside, but they've asked us to do top 10s on the model. And honestly, I think maybe that shows my failure to explain it. You can't, because it may say team A will beat team B, which will beat team C, which will beat team A. It'll do the triangle because it's purely based off the matchups in this particular game. So in these two teams, it's kind of a mirror image at several points, but then there's one glaring problem for Penn State and glaring relative strength for Ohio State that kind of blows the whole thing open. One of the intermediary statistics that I love is this percentage of opponent averages allowed. The idea being, rather than talking about if you hold a team to 4 yards per carry, are you holding your opponents to 120% of their average or 60% of their averages, right? Account for the strength of your opponents and just say, was it a good day or a bad day in general when they played you? Everybody that's played Ohio State and then Penn State's had a bad day running the football. 61, 62%, about the same level of run defense. Penn State is as good against their opponents in run D as Ohio State has been throughout the season. The difference has been pass defense. Ohio State is just as good in pass D, 71%. I say a lot. Passing games carry, running games don't. Good defenses shut down the run really consistently. We all the time see those numbers drop quite a bit when they're playing an elite defense. Pass D numbers, it's hard to keep a team below 75% of their average. That's why when you play elite passing offenses, you can really struggle in a playoff situation because they do tend to get theirs. Ohio State at 71% is awesome. That's a really, really good number. Penn State's at 95%. Right at people's season averages. They've done it all year. They've played a lot of teams that couldn't throw the football. So holding them to low numbers wasn't necessarily an accomplishment when they've played teams that could, like Minnesota that averages 10.8, or in Indiana that averages 8.2 yards per attempt. They've gotten theirs throwing the football on Penn State. And so that's concerning. Their bad days have just correlated with the strength of their opponent. And that's what it comes down to in this model. Ohio State averages 6 yards per carry. The model doesn't think they'll average 4 in this game. Penn State averages 4.17. They're not even expected to average 3. They're probably going to get about 2.5 yards per carry. The problem is Ohio State's going to get theirs throwing the ball. 8.7 yards per attempt. That's a really good average. Penn State's not expected to throw the ball for crap. Under 6 yards per attempt. That difference, like 6 yards per play to 4 yards per play, doesn't sound like a lot, but this is where that non-linear regressive stuff comes in. You would go from 4 yards per play to 6 yards per play, or in this case, 4.1 to 5.8. So, that's like a 35% increase in yard per play. You're going to increase your scoring over 50%, just because you're going to be able to. At 6 yards per play, you can get a first down every 2 plays. 4 yards per play, you got to take 3. That means you can afford an incompletion and still get a first down, where Penn State can't. That's kind of how it breaks down. That's why the model has it 35-21. And 2 touchdowns seems fair. And I'll say, before you jump into it and comment, Daniel, you talked about last year's model. Now, it was week 5 last year, so things are really screwy when we only have 4 data points. But a lot of what we get out of this is sort of scaling and an idea of how the game is going to flow. And we talk a lot that the absolute score is helpful, but a lot of it has to do with margins and sort of margins in yardage and margins in points. Last year's prediction was 56-52, which we knew was ridiculously high point total, though we correctly called very early on that Ohio State had defensive deficiencies. But what I think is interesting, 56-52, the game was 27-26. Almost exactly half that score on both sides. So the score absolute number may be off, but when you talk about margins and the difference, the model had it bang on, and that was in week 5 last year with very little data. So that's that 2 touchdown lead. You can give it or take it, but it's basically saying that Ohio State's about 60% better than Penn State.
Yeah, and Vegas has got it at 17 points right now, and this is one of those games where, not to continue to draw the comparisons to Alabama, but Alabama, when they've played better teams, I don't want to insult Penn State fans by saying this comparison, but this to me feels a lot like Alabama playing at Texas A&M, where it's a 9-3 type team with a good schedule, and Alabama usually is favored in that game by a couple of touchdowns. This feels a lot like that to me, where in the past we'd see Vegas sort of undercut Alabama or an elite team, and they would constantly cover, and then they finally say, okay, you're playing a good team. We're going to give you a number. Let's see what you can do. And you keep saying, show me, and that's kind of what Vegas is doing right here too. I'm going to go ahead and give my score for me. So I've got Alabama 37, or Alabama. I can't do that. I'm going to go ahead and give my score. So I've got Ohio State 37 and Penn State 17. And I think there are some matchup issues here where if KJ Hamler can play, I'm not sure what the result was. I think he got pulled out for concussion protocol. He'll probably play. If he can play, he probably is a huge mismatch for Ohio State. But Clifford's got to get in the ball, and he's got to score. Because as we said before, where Clifford has been able to scramble and have a couple of big runs and can have a drive that would have died end up being a touchdown. If Ohio State's shutting that down, then it's all on Clifford to throw the ball. And we saw against Minnesota, Rainbow City throwing up a bunch of 50-50 balls that he shouldn't have. And let's say he does get a couple of those to Hamler and he does score a couple of times. That's going to be what their offense is like, because I don't see them driving the field consistently against this Ohio State defense. I think it's going to be tight early. It's going to be a lot like the Wisconsin game, although I think Penn State is a better team. I think because there's more on the line, it's late in the season, and Penn State was probably preparing ahead for Ohio State, it's going to be a better game than Michigan State or Wisconsin for Ohio State, but it's going to be like that where it's tight early. Penn State doesn't have the offense to capitalize if Ohio State doesn't come out just scoring. And over time, Ohio State just kind of squeezes them, and the score ends up something like 37-17, in my opinion.
So for me in this game, I've got it 31-14. It really boils down to the fact that I don't think Penn State's going to have a lot of success with a traditional passing offense. And they can get some going downfield. They've got, like you said, a little explosiveness. Even if Hamler isn't able to get it to go, I think Penn State can generate some passing, right? I mean, Dotson's a good receiver. Freiermuth has been consistently good for him. I just don't know without Hamler that they're going to get the one or two explosive plays they would need to be able to get a couple touchdowns and stay in it. In a best case scenario, they'd really have to play really good defense. And I think the problem is, I think they will play good defense. I think they'll play better defense in Wisconsin, which is why I have them scoring less. It's just that's still 31 points. And if that's where you're at, then you're already in trouble with Penn State. And we were talking about this before the broadcast. Our question kind of was, at what point does Penn State need to score? You can hear me clicking because I want to look up all the scores in front of me to be able to win this game. And we both kind of felt like probably more than 35. And I can say 31-14 because I'm assuming that Penn State isn't moving the ball and there's going to be a certain amount of, taking the foot off the gas from Ohio State in that scenario. I'm also thinking this game's going to be shortened, by the way. I think Penn State's going to try to make it as short as possible. But Penn State hasn't scored 36 points in a ball game since September against Maryland. And that's my problem. And yes, there have been some good defenses in there, but Purdue was not a great defense. Indiana was not a great defense. I don't think Michigan State was a great defense, and they're still not scoring 36 points. I mean, if your offense is at a certain point, it just can't get in the 40s because it's not consistent enough. And that's, I think, the problem they have because they don't have, as I said earlier in the year, high-level traditional receivers where they can operate a traditional 5 to 15-yard passing game with underneath routes with guys that have height and enough speed and athleticism to get separation that you need to move the sticks. And Clifford is not a good enough quarterback. There have been way too many rainbow balls. Ohio State's going to get pressure. Clifford's going to throw some of those up. I think the same sort of interceptions you saw against Minnesota are going to happen here, but probably worse, particularly if they're behind in a way that they have not had to play, by the way. I don't know what they're going to do when that happens. And I think what's going to happen is they're going to get behind a couple scores. They're actually going to have to pass, really have to pass for the first time all year. I guess you could make an argument for Minnesota, but again, you're going to have the same sort of argument thing that happened in Minnesota when they had to really throw it. It's going to generate turnovers, and that's just where it is in my view between Penn State and Ohio State. Ohio State is an excellent team. Penn State can be in a very, very good team and lose this game by a significant margin. It turns out, I said 17, which you're saying is right at the point spread. I didn't know that. And we'll see where it goes because I think it could get worse or better depending on how turnovers go. But my inclination is that it's a shortened game that Ohio State in some ways controls more than the Wisconsin game, but they control it traditionally, whereas Wisconsin, they were able to kind of put them away and then get off the field. I think it's going to take them 4 quarters to get to that point with Penn State.
So I'm curious your thoughts in terms of like what could happen in this game or what needs to happen in this game for you to drop Ohio State from number 1 to number 2. Is it a loss and then they drop further, or could you see a scenario in this game where it plays out in a way that would give you question marks enough that next week when we're doing our top 10, LSU's number 1, Ohio State's number 2?
So there are a couple things I would say that Ohio State's struggled with at times in the past that I would be curious to see if they rear their ugly head. The first is if Penn State's able to take away the underneath stuff, like we said, the zone read concepts, and do it straight up in a way that Wisconsin really couldn't because they had to overcompensate, can they slow down Ohio State's run game enough without committing extra bodies such that Ohio State can't just burn them over the top the way they have other teams and kind of slow down or shut down Ohio State's offense. And I say that just like if Ohio State scores in the 20 to 30 range, I'm going to be a little concerned because there's a lot of teams at the upper echelon of college football right now like LSU, that's probably going to put up 40 points against just about everybody. And you could be an elite defense, which I think Ohio State is, and you're still probably going to give up 30. It's just kind of because the RPO is broken college football, frankly, and that's where we're at right now in 2019. That's my first concern. My second concern with Ohio State is defensively, they've been rock solid and not blowing the sort of weird, easy scores. But I'll also say they haven't played teams that had the athleticism to do that. I don't know if Hamler plays, but especially if Hamler plays, they can generate a little bit of that again with Dotson. Can Penn State get some of those explosive plays or like RPO plays? Because that would also be very telling if they could get Ohio State discombobulated. We're projecting against teams down the road that are at a very high level. I debated whether to say this, but I'm going to say it. Teams that are frankly probably a lot better than Penn State is right now. So you have to kind of nitpick. It's going to take a lot for me, though, to drop them below number one, given that LSU struggled defensively all through the year. But this is the first real complete team that I feel like Ohio State's played, particularly in the defensive side of the ball. And I really want to see, as I said all the time with them, talking a lot of my constant complaints with JT Barrett, I want to see an offense that scales, an offense that doesn't start slowing down, playing a better defense. It's been their Achilles heel. I don't think it is right now. They're a lot more spread, or a lot more effective vertically, a lot more effective horizontally throwing the ball. But that's my curiosity in this game for Ohio State.
All right, y'all, that's our preview for Penn State, Ohio State. I want to remind you, we also do audio versions of these. They usually come out Monday or Tuesday. We've been doing a lot better about that. iTunes, Android, and we post on our website full-length audio with just a click away. Also remember, we do a top 10, and we are doing that LSU and Ohio State preview this week. It's a hypothetical, same model. Wanted to talk about it. Y'all find it interesting. Thanks so much. Y'all have a great week, and God bless.